Good morning, A-Pushers. Purpose of this video is going to take a look at topic 9.2 on Ronald Reagan and conservatism. We'll do a little bit of a recap of some of the 1980s political changes that we've talked about in class previously, and then we'll just kind of do a little fast forward through the 90s and 2000s to see how some of those changes are reflected in later presidential elections. Here we go. So we did look at this slide of notes in class previously, so I do not want to do a whole lot of rehashing of everything on here, but just to kind of recap and set some context for us. In the 1980s, Reagan comes in as a Republican president and is really kind of ushering in a new wave of conservative beliefs, sometimes referred to as the Reagan Revolution. This kind of goes along with the idea of supply side economics, trying to get some economic assistance to the, richer Americans and to corporations so they can, in good capitalist tradition, extend those savings onto the rest of the population. There's also going to be a desire to kind of get back to some traditional social values as influenced by the religious right, as you can kind of see a little bit of that in that inset slide on 814, and kind of reducing the role of the government. Once you get out of the 1980s on these domestic issues, this is really where politics kind of sits, is the questions about how much of a role the federal government should be playing in day-to-day lives. Now, I know this is something that's kind of been on again, off again, a political debate for the bulk of American history. But once you get into even into the early 1990s, there's questions about the role of government and how the government could run things more effectively. So let's take a look at this. I think the most efficient way to take a look at this is going to be to look at some of the election history that we've got going from the 1990s, really kind of sort of up to the present. So in these elections, and I'll try to make reference to everything as we go through, but there's really like 2 or 3 elections to kind of pay some particular attention to. So in the 1992 election, questions about the role of government and conservatism and liberalism, this is really kind of reflected with the addition of a new political party to the mix, kind of a temporary third party in this sort of set of things. In the 92 election, the 2 major candidates for the 2 central parties is George H.W. Bush. He served 2 terms as Reagan's vice president, and then in 1988 he was elected president, and here he's running for re-election. And his Democratic opponent in this race is Bill Clinton. Clinton's a baby boomer. He was born after World War II, really the first president to be of that generation, and so there's a little bit of like this change of personality that's coming in, like that older greatest generation from Bush or versus baby boomers from Clinton. In terms of like political beliefs, this is kind of like Reagan conservatism versus maybe like a new generational approach, maybe a push against those conservative beliefs and trying to bring things back towards liberalism, with some questions about how effective the government is at running these things, making decisions for everybody anyway. The third party that comes into the mix is called the Reform Party, and their candidate in 1992 is H. Ross Perot. He is a Texas billionaire, makes his money a little bit in the oil industry, a little bit in technology industry, but he is going to really kind of focus on a little bit of supply side, but trying to just sort of simplify government in a lot of ways. Politically, he stands closer on the political spectrum to President Bush than he does to Clinton. And so the theory is, when you look at the results, that Perot pulled more votes from Bush than he did from anybody else, which kind of has an impact on how the election turned out. So with the election totals, we've got like the vote totals, and we can see the electoral map. Just on the electoral map, there's no real sectionalism, regionalism on this divide. There's a little bit of it there, but it's really just kind of a mishmash. And the reason for this mishmash on the map, that was hard to say, is because Perot pulls in 19% of the popular vote. In virtually every state in the Union, Perot pulled somewhere between 15 and 25%. And if you assume that he is pulling votes away from President Bush, the conclusion is that Bush would have won more states. And so, to say it another way, there is a belief out there that Perot cost Bush the election. But one way or the other, Clinton is elected on this and is going to serve 2 terms as a Democratic president in the 1990s, because he's going to get reelected in his own right in 1996. And so Clinton's reelection here kind of shows that maybe there is like a fairly even political divide between the conservative beliefs that the Reagan Revolution puts out there and maybe a new era of 1960s era liberalism that could be coming back in. Clinton really represents a blending of those 2 ideas, and so he appeals to a pretty broad scope of voters. By the time you get late into the Clinton presidency, there are issues with his impeachment trial, and he is acquitted of anything in that impeachment trial. He is not impeached. But by the time, that was in 1999, by the time you get to the election of 2000, we're back to another election here where you have like real contentious attitudes coming into it. The 2 candidates here are George W. Bush. This is Bush Jr. or Bush 43, who, spoiler, is going to be the winner of this election. And you've got the Democratic candidate Al Gore. Gore was Clinton's vice president for 2 terms and kind of still represents that generational divide when it comes down to, well, a new wave of liberalism that kind of sprinkles in some of these conservative beliefs. There's a third party in the mix here. The third party in this case is the Green Party, which is still around these days. Perot's Reform Party doesn't make it into the 2000s, but the Green Party is still there, and their candidate is Ralph Nader. And when we kind of pulled the same, kind of numbers and pulled the map back up this time, you can see first off, Nader gets a much smaller percentage of the vote. But the other thing that kind of should jump out at you is like, this is a really close election on the popular vote. That Nader pulling in that small of a percentage still has an impact on the popular vote. If you assume that Nader and the Green Party is going to be pulling votes away from the Democrats, well, if you add those votes back in, well, then some of the red states on that map would have flipped sides. And even on the electoral college totals, you can see that this is a really, really close election. Other thing, well, let's get to the big issue with this, because the big issue that makes the 2000 election notable is the controversy surrounding those electoral votes. Because over in Florida, the entire state is so close. We're talking about just a few hundred votes making the difference on this. That one state is enough to swing the entire electoral decision. So they begin the process of having recounts in Florida, recounting the state results for president everywhere in all counties and all jurisdictions. But the recounts are happening kind of haphazardly. It's happening in some counties but not in other counties. And by the time you get through November into December and there's still not a clear winner, the Supreme Court gets involved. And the Supreme Court case is Bush versus Gore, which is kind of, same as the election, right? But in this decision, the Supreme Court says that the Florida recounts have to stop because there's not a legal situation put out there that kind of spells out how those recounts should happen. And since there's no consistency in the recounts, it means all of the recounts are invalid, and that means that the election holds true as it is, and Bush wins the election in Florida and wins the election with the Electoral College by 5 votes, even though Gore wins on the popular vote side of things. So, while it is possible to win to get more popular votes but lose the election, it doesn't happen very often. This hadn't happened in the United States since the 1880s, and so this was kind of raising some questions about the validity of Bush as president. I'm not going to go there, but I will definitely point out that this means that there is definitely some contentious feelings about electoral politics just in the long run. So as you take a look at presidential politics going into the 2000s, Bush's presidency is going to go for 2 terms because of foreign policy issues, including the war on terror and some domestic reforms that he's going to, kind of hold true to some of the Reagan era conservative beliefs. In 2008 and then again in 2012, Barack Obama is going to be elected president, which represents another shift back over towards a new wave of Democrat, where it's going to be 1960s liberalism with some, adherence to some of the more recent conservative beliefs. Some of the more notable, maybe the most notable addition on the liberal end of the debates under the Obama administration is going to be passage of the Affordable Care Act, which is going to create Obamacare. It's like the healthcare system, national healthcare system that's going to be adopted by the federal government, a way to make sure that all Americans have got some level of health insurance provided to them. This is kind of a notable, addition into presidential politics, and it's going to lead to the controversies over what is the proper role of the government. And so by the time you get to 2012 through the last years of Obama's 2 terms, there's more of a question about like what the role of the government should be, and the mistrust for the government is going to lead just into more current electoral college disputes and controversies. Because in the 2016 election, when Trump wins the election, he defeats Hillary Clinton, even though Hillary Clinton had more popular votes. So again, after the 2016 election, there's a lot of mistrust towards the Electoral College, and there's some questioning of what's happening in terms of the voting processes are concerned. But Trump is elected president. And this level of political controversy is going to continue and extend into the 2020 election. When Biden defeats Trump, Biden has the majority of the popular votes, has more popular votes, and he has more electoral votes. And so it seems to be a clear election victory for Biden. But because of accusations of voter fraud and accusations of the stolen election, there gets to be an increased level of mistrust for the election results, leading to the issues around January 6, 2021, where there is sort of like this invasion of election protesters at the U.S. Capitol building. So this really kind of fast forwards us into like modern politics, and I don't really want to talk about that, but this is worth kind of the moment to take a look back and see that there's a pattern here of contentious elections, and I think you can make the argument that over a 30-year stretch, this might be one of the more contentious 30-year periods in presidential elections. But that's what we've got on this, and I know there's a little bit of detail in here, but it's just really big to make sure you're knowing some of the big picture to try to tie this maybe to some earlier time periods. Thanks for listening.